Hello, good people! Mighty Mordugal here, the miniature minstrel, your friendly gnome bard. Alright, so we've now created Arda Under the Stars in the first stage of Middle-earth. Let's populate it. So what we're going to do is we will select this custom realm, and then we're going to edit it. And the reason that we're going to edit it is because we want to be able to actually establish the factions that are in this realm. So we've picked all of our traits. Now what we want to do is we want to go to advanced settings. And we're going to create our different factions. Now, in this case, what we're going to do, we're going to keep the player distance standard. We don't want it to be too close. We want a little bit of exploration. But we're going to change this to 9. That's the maximum number of players that you can have, or sort of factions that you can have in a single game. We'll keep it on the difficulty of normal. We're going to do classic turns rather than having everybody move simultaneously. So if we go into advanced settings, what this is going to allow us to do is, of course, you can name it, you can change your visuals and all that kind of stuff. But the real important part here is the factions, and we're going to create the individual factions here. As we have discussed, the whole theory that we're going with here, the theme that we want to emphasize with this playthrough is it's going to be essentially the awakening of the dwarves and the sort of expansion of the dwarven cities and those kindreds of dwarves in the first age of Middle-earth. Now, so what do we know about the dwarves? Well, so again, without getting into too much detail, most people who are familiar with the Lord of the Rings, or any kind of classic fantasy sort of tropes for that matter, right? Your dwarves are your standard kind of stocky, tough, bearded folk, really good at smithing and building and that sort of thing. But in the case of the dwarves of Middle-earth, by the time of the Lord of the Rings, there's really only sort of one of the original 7 kindreds of dwarves, as Tolkien later describes in some of his papers, that actually survives to the time of Middle-earth, as far as we are aware, and that kindred is known as the Longbeards. Now, the Longbeards kindred happens to be the oldest, or the first kindred to awake, and it is considered sort of in most of Tolkien's writings, you get the impression that it is the most important and oldest kindred. And it is also the most adaptable, as it sort of kind of survives throughout many thousands of years of history. And for those of you that are familiar with the Lord of the Rings, the character of Gimli, the dwarf, is actually descended from the kindred of the Longbeards, whose line is the line of Durin. So this is going to be Durin the Deathless, which is the name of the first dwarf to awake in Middle-earth. And so if we choose him and take a look at what he's got, so you can see what I've given him here. So I've given him the Tome of Warding, and the whole idea here is that the line of Durin is famous for sort of the use of mithril, the finding and delving of mithril. Of course, Bilbo Baggins is given a shirt of rings, a ring mail made of mithril, famously in The Hobbit, and then that is passed down to Frodo in The Lord of the Rings. And it's said to be able to turn aside essentially any blade. You can see that we've named them the Longbeards, and in terms of traits, I have given them Resilient, which is that units are less likely to be affected by negative statuses. I've given them Adaptable, so they're gonna gain experience much more quickly, and sort of the idea here between these traits is that I want to sort of lean into this idea that the dwarves of Durin's line are the most adaptable and long-lived of all the dwarven race, and so they're the sort of the only ones really to survive into the Third Age when the events of the Lord of the Rings happen. And so I've given them Industrious, which improves, this is going to be their culture. So when you're creating factions, you're going to create a number of different things. And so like if we go into edit, you'll first select your Dwarfkin, in this case for what we're trying to do. There's a bunch of other things you can select from. You can create whatever you want, but we're going to select the Dwarfkin. And then this is where you're going to choose the culture. And so in this case, I've chosen Industrious, mostly because I like the theme. I think it's the more traditional kind of dwarven theme that we have here. In terms of play style, what this is going to allow for you, though, is it's going to increase your production. You're going to be able to bolster units. So when they get hit by a melee or a physical attack, their defenses will get actually much better. They also have scout prospecting, and so what this means is that they can prospect. They can stand in a province and they can prospect for extra production or gold rewards. So I think this fits that kind of that theme that I'm going for these great sort of miners and smiths.
What defines their society?
In terms of the society traits, which is the next step, I've chosen the Chosen Uniters here. And that's because the whole goal of this playthrough is going to be to have, during the Deathless, unite the Kindreds of the Dwarves and kind of create the ancient Dwarven Empire that exists more or less loosely in the first age and into the Second Age. So you can see the bonuses that it's going to give us. It's going to make our shield units and our polearm units much better. So really, really good for defense. We're going to start with extra of those unit types. And it's also going to give us diplomatic focus. And we'll talk a little bit about Whispering Stones more later, but the bottom line is a Whispering Stone is a sort of artifact that you can give to the city-states that you encounter that you would like to sort of ally with, and potentially even have them kind of join your faction eventually. And so you can also give these to these cities to sort of increase your ability to trade with them or potentially get new units and that sort of thing. But I also think it thematically plays with this idea that I want to have Durin kind of try and unite the houses of the dwarves. Also, we've selected Runesmith as our other society trait, which is a bit of a no-brainer. Kind of leaning into that sort of dwarven trope. So this is going to increase our research towards unit enchantment, which are different spells that you can research in the game. So they're going to be cheaper. It's also going to be not only cheaper to research, but also cheaper to keep active, in the sense that any enchantment that you place on a unit is going to require an upkeep. And so this will reduce that for us. Importantly, it also gives us, this trait gives us shield units and polearm units gaining a +1 rank, making them stronger. So again, this kind of hardy, classic dwarven race, great warriors, heavily encased in sort of, mithril armor and that sort of thing is where we're going with this. And we'll also get an extra polearm or shield unit. So if we'll select that,
choose your first tome.
And then in terms of the tomes that we're going to select, which is the kind of magic that we're going to be able to cast throughout the game, we are going to go with the Tome of Warding. And the reason, again, I've chosen this Tome of Warding is because I feel like just thematically it is sort of reflective of this idea of the sort of the mining and smithying of mithril armor. And so a lot of the spells that you can see here that we're going to get access to are going to make our troops much tougher. Going to be much more resistant to magic and essentially be able to sort of sustain a kind of a lot more damage, or sort of ward off a lot of that damage. The idea being because of that mithril armor.
What is your ruler's origin?
So then the next step is that we will select a Wizard King or a champion. So in general, Wizard Kings are going to be sort of magic-focused characters that don't necessarily have to come from the faction that you've created. You can choose another. So, instance, you could have an elf leading an orc faction, for instance. But again, we're going with this theme of the dwarves in the First Age. So we're going to choose a champion. You can see the bonuses that it'll give us here.
Reveal yourself.
And this is where you get to customize basically your visuals, right, for the race and for your lead character, right? Just a ton, absolute ton of customization options in here for those that haven't been following Age of Wonders 4. It's really, really incredible. So we've already kind of set all that kind of stuff, but you can change all of this kind of stuff. You know, I could change his helmet if I wanted to something else, right? I can do all kinds of stuff. Change the size of them, everything. Giving him a great hammer as his weapon, I think that's pretty emblematic. And then you can also edit the race as well, so his actual soldiers. And so again, you can change their stature, right? So, you know, can make them a little bit thinner, right? If you wanted to, you can make them taller or shorter. Lot of options here. So anyway, so yeah, so here is Durin the Deathless and his Longbeards. The Longbeard Kindred, first of the 7 Kindreds. Oh yeah, so let's change this real quick so you can edit the names and everything. And so, we will call him, we're going to give him a custom title, which I think is just more appropriate. And he is going to be the First Father, because in the Tolkien lore, basically the original dwarves to awake are known as the 7 fathers of the dwarves, and it's from their line that most of the famous dwarves of Middle-earth come. And so Durin, the first of these kindreds, he's going to be the First Father. Okay, so there are 6 other kindreds that we're gonna kind of create here, or I've actually already created.
Your journey.
So in this case, the second kindred that's described in the history of Middle-earth, in the peoples of Middle-earth to awake, the second and the third are Firebeards and Broadbeams. And so we'll go into custom here, and you can see that I have already created our Firebeards. So here's our Firebeards. Now, who are we modeling these Firebeards off? So the Firebeards, I've sort of taken some license with both the name of the tribe, or kindred as Tolkien gives it, which is, you know, fire, but also there is a reference, essentially in the Silmarillion, to a very famous dwarf named Telkar the Smith, who is from the dwarven city of Novgorod. And he is considered in the Tolkien lore to be the mightiest smith, essentially, that has ever lived. And so I really wanted to lean into that theme for Telkar the Smith. And so the idea is that I'm kind of trying to merge the idea that Novgorod was where Telkar the Smith was from, and that he was indeed this master smith. And so we've sort of given them the Tome of Pyromancy, which is a fire kind of specialization, and it's going to give them things like fiery arrows and searing blades, kind of this idea, right, that he's like forging mighty weapons. For the actual race traits, we've given them resistance, so they're magic. They have magic resistance, and also this idea that they have an arcane focus. So Telkar the Smith is famous for creating a couple of artifacts, essentially, in the Tolkien Legendarium. And so the idea is, it's kind of hinted at that, like, you know, sort of, not only is he skilled, but he also is able to sort of channel, like, what is kind of referred to as sort of dwarven magic, or this sort of kind of mystical capabilities that the dwarves have in terms of, like, infusing their the weapons and other creations that they make with sort of kind of unusual power. We've chosen Industrious, just like we did for Durin, and then we've chosen as the society traits. We have chosen Ancient Wise Ones, which is going to increase the speed at which we can unlock the different spell tomes to sort of learn new spells and transformations for our units, and it will make some of those cheaper. We've also selected runesmiths, again leaning into this idea, mighty smith, right? Here he is, Telkar the Smith, that nice red sort of tone and hue. You know, a guy who's been kind of staring at forge fires for hundreds of years, and he's got that sort of dark, shadowy kind of like, you know, soot all around him and everything like that. You know, sort of really leaning into this idea that he's this mighty smith working in these forges of Nogrod. Okay, and Telkar is because he's associated with the Firebeards, they are the second kindred. And so what we're going to call him is the second father. Okay. Moving on, the third kindred that we're going to look at are the Broadbeams. And so it's sort of hinted that the Broadbeams, like the Firebeards, were dwarves that arose in sort of the Blue Mountains, essentially. And so these are the mountains that are kind of, by the time in the middle of the Lord of the Rings, they're the furthest western mountains. But at the time, they're actually more centrally located, as we had mentioned in our previous video. Okay, here we are. So here's our Broadbeams, right? Kind of like a very kind of martial sort of flavor with these guys. And the Broadbeams, I sort of wanted to associate with the other aspect of Dwarven culture that is made so famous by Tolkien, but has been adopted by many Dwarven fantasy sort of themed games, books, movies, etc. And that's this idea of great builders. And so I have used the name Nain, the builder, for this particular Dwarven father. And you'll note, if you are deep into the lore like I am in terms of Tolkien lore, I've chosen Nain because Nain is one of the descendants of Durin. It's a famous kind of name that pops up in Dwarven lineage. And so I wanted to have this idea that, you know, I wanted to pull from names that existed in the lore. And so while this guy, in this case, is not going to be a descendant of Durin, I feel that their name, I wanted to have a connection to sort of some of these other famous names in Durin's essentially line. So Nain the Builder, we've given the Tome of Enchantment. So it's going to make him much more effective at sort of improving his troops through various enchantments, so like Sundering Blades, Seeker Arrows, and that sort of thing, Spell-Tempered Shields, and that kind of thing. But also it gives you Awakened Tools, which is really good for increasing the production of cities. And it also gives some unique province improvements, which will also increase your sort of production output, particularly for queries, which I think is very thematic here. So again, we got they're called the Broadbeams. I've given them Tough, and I've given them Defensive Tactics as their unique traits for their actual body and mind traits. And then leaning into this idea of them being the great builders that sort of delved the mighty dwarven mansions in Belegost and Nogrod. I sort of gave them great builders and wonder architects as their faction specific traits. All right, so we're gonna select him, but we want to edit him. So when we finalize him, we are going to give him the title of Third Father. So he will be the third father of the dwarves. Okay, so moving on. Now this is where it gets a little bit more difficult, and I had to really kind of start being a little bit more creative about how I was going to create the remaining 4 Kindreds of Dwarves, because there's just not a whole lot of information provided in much of Tolkien's sort of works as to who these dwarves were, what, you know, sort of what was unique about them, or sort of where they physically were located, other than we know that they came from further east in Middle-earth, and were, at least if you read the People of Middle-earth, you know, and Tolkien's paper on sort of Dwarven language, he mentions that he sort of suspects, right, or kind of hints that, like, much like a lot of the peoples of humans that came out of the east of Middle-earth, that they may have fallen under the shadow. That is to say, the shadow of Morgoth, who actually creates the more famous sort of Dark Lord of Sauron, who most people are familiar with from the Lord of the Rings. But I wanted to kind of experiment with sort of, you know, how would these sort of Dwarven factions play out that kind of grew up further in the east and had to contend with the sort of shadow of Morgoth and the Dark Lord, the dark powers of Middle-earth. So for the first of these four that is referenced, it's the Iron Fists. And for the Iron Fists, I got the sense of, with that name, that Iron Fists, like of a kind of a tough, a sort of almost like a barbarian race of dwarves, right? And so that's what I leaned into here. So I've created a sort of barbarian dwarven race. You got lots of furs and an axe and everything, you know, and sort of, you know, very muscular and that sort of thing. And to kind of lean into that theme, I've given them the Tome of Beasts, which is going to give them some spells which will kind of make them sort of faster and stronger, makes them work really well together with animals, and sort of get a lot of bonuses for having animals in their armies. And so the idea is it's a lot of damage dealing and a sort of an intrinsic sort of kind of being in touch with nature, and that's kind of what I wanted to lean in with for these Iron Fists. I wanted them to be a sort of kind of a barbaric kind of dwarven race. So I've made them strong, so they're going to do more physical damage, and I've made them tenacious. And what this does is it's going to reduce the damage penalties from taking casualties. So this is one of the unique kind of things in the game, is that when your units of troops take casualties, they actually they lose strength and they can't put out as much damage. So if you had a unit of 8 and you lost 4 of those models in the unit, then they're not going to do as much damage. And so this keeps them strong. So the idea is that even when these dwarves are down and out, even when they're hurting and they've been wounded and they've had casualties, they fight hard, and they're still like kind of terrible foes to face. I've given them the barbarian faction culture, which is going to give them a primal strike, so dealing a little extra damage on that first strike. And I've given them ruthless raiders, so they're going to get money and they're going to get draft. That is, draft is used to build troops in the game. They're going to get that draft to help be able to generate more forces. Each time they kill units, they're going to get rewarded for doing that. And then finally, I've given them fabled hunters, making their ranged units and skirmishers, which they have a couple of in their ranks, more deadly. It will also give them more resources for clearing out infestations and ancient wonders and resource nodes and that sort of thing. So anything they clear out on the map is going to be real beneficial to them. All right, so we are going to select him. We'll go to finalize. He's going to be our 4th father. So 4th father, Gloin the Slayer of the Iron Fists, a mighty barbarian dwarf. All right, so we've got now 3 more dwarves to go. So the next one that I wanted to do here, what if there was a dwarven race that was like the Longbeards, but arose further in the east, and so, you know, was kind of a very structured society and that sort of thing, had not necessarily fallen under the shadow and was very resistant to the shadow. And so the 5th house or 5th kindred of the dwarves listed in the peoples of Middle-earth is the Stiffbeards. And so we've created the Stiffbeards, and that's these guys. And I've given them the sort of feudal culture, that's available in the game, which gives them a sort of a little bit more of a traditional kind of look. Like, I'm thinking sort of less advanced dwarves in terms of technology, but in terms of society, still a very kind of structured society. And with a name like Stiffbeards, I wanted to kind of invoke this idea that they're very very kind of tough and sort of unbending and sort of, well, stiff, right? And so if we take a look at these guys,
what is your people's form?
I've given them Resolute, and I've given them Overwhelm tactics. So Resolute is going to prevent negative status effects, or at least rather slow them down. Overwhelm tactics, so this makes them stronger when they work together, and I wanted this idea of like a really organized sort of dwarven society for these folks. We've got the feudal culture, which is it gives them stand together. Again, makes them even tougher and do more damage when they work together. And then for society traits, I gave them imperialists and I gave them great builders. And the idea was, again, I wanted this structured society, but they probably had a very regimented society, and that's why I've chosen imperialists here. And so that any provinces that share a border with their main city are gonna get more gold and happiness and that sort of thing. All right. I've also given them great builders, given this idea that like they, like the dwarves in the west of Middle Earth, have kind of created powerful sort of settlement, mountain settlements and that sort of thing, built into the rocks. Okay.
Choose your first.
The one with Tome of Zeal for this one is all about kind of empowering the society. And it also gives them strengthened if they have zeal, which is a mechanic that you can play around with in this tome. So the whole idea being a faction that has a lot of very strong traditions.
What is your ruler's origin?
Again, we've chosen champion for these guys. I gave them the key to kind of this idea of the key to the kingdom, right? The sort of the vaults of the dwarves and having a kind of like a very structured and regimented society. All right, so we've taken the name of Dane. So this will be the fifth father, Dane. Dane being another of those famous dwarven names that comes out of the line of Durin. Even though once again the idea being that this is a separate line of dwarves from that of Durin, but I wanted to kind of keep some lore-friendly names. Okay, so for our sixth kindred of dwarves, I wanted to go in a slightly different direction, and I wanted to sort of play into this idea that is hinted at in the history of Middle-earth, that perhaps the dwarves of the East had fallen under the shadow and had perhaps become evil dwarves. Now, most dwarves in sort of in the history of Middle-earth, whether it's in The Hobbit or in The Lord of the Rings or even in the Silmarillion, are not sort of kind of identified as being evil, right? They're kind of more of a neutral sort of race, and often aided the elves and men in their wars against Morgoth and his servant Sauron. But there are one group of dwarves that are very much sort of depicted as essentially being outcasts because they did evil things, or their fathers and ancestors had done evil things in the early days of Middle-earth, so in the first and the second age. And the whole idea is these are the petty dwarves. That's what they're referred to. If you've read the Silmarillion or the Children of Hurin, they're referred to as the petty dwarves. They were smaller of stature than other dwarves, more sickly, didn't live as long, and were also, in terms of personality, much more sort of conniving and sort of surreptitious and sort of dissembling and sort of prone to lie and that sort of thing. And so I really wanted to lean into a faction sort of that had those kinds of characteristics. But rather than having them sort of be from this idea that they're exiles from a whole bunch of different Dwarven factions, I sort of wanted to play with this idea that, you know, perhaps at one time in the First Age, many of these exiles from these other cities that had sort of evil, more evil sort of predilections, kind of found each other and kind of came together for shared interest, essentially, and created their own sort of smaller, kind of less powerful, but still kind of unified kingdom of petty dwarves. And so, what I have done is I have created the petty dwarves. We've created Mim the Petty, so you'll recognize that name if you've read either the Silmarillion or the Children of Hurin. He is essentially one of 3 of these petty dwarves that are left alive towards the sort of end of the First Age. They're the last of their kind. But I kind of wanted to go with this idea that just like other dwarves, that this particular group of dwarves would have used the same names over and over and over again throughout their line, like the fact that there was, you know, multiple Durins in the line of Durin. And so I had this idea that there were multiple Mims in the line of the petty dwarves. Now, in terms of what kindred to name these, well, I thought that, you know, sort of the 2 remaining sort of kindreds that are mentioned by Tolkien and don't get any description, the Blacklocks and the Stonefoots, I thought the Blacklocks sounded appropriate for the Mim the Petty. A kind of long, kind of dark, kind of perhaps not well kept hair, you know, you would associate with the sort of these dwarves that have essentially were outcasts. And so that's kind of what I've leaned into for him. And so you can see I've given him sort of, you know, like this matted hair and sort of kind of, he doesn't get the gold beard rings and everything like the other dwarves do and that sort of thing. And in terms of skill sets that we've given them, I've went with the Tome of Cryomancy, so they are getting essentially shadow magic, or shadow affinity here, because of that sort of evil streak. We've also given them quick reflexes, which makes them harder to hit by range attacks, and sneaky, which allows them to do more damage on flanking attacks. And I thought this played really well into this theme that these petty dwarves are essentially kind of like villainous, right? And, you know, if you go and you read the Children of Hurin or you read the Silmarillion, you know, I don't want to spoil it for those who haven't, you know, but the bottom line is that these guys do some bad stuff. The petty dwarves in the Silmarillion and the Children of Hurin are not nice folks. And so I thought that went well with the thematic kind of idea here. We've given them dark culture, so they get extra income from prisons and crypts that they can build, get that extra knowledge income. And then also they specialize inflicting negative status effects on enemies. And they get this Cold or Weak ability, which deals damage, additional damage to units that already are weakened. So weakened is a status effect that can be cast on units. That kind of basically makes them, the units that are being cast on, deal less damage. And then on top of that, when these guys will attack those weakened targets, they will also regenerate hit points. Sort of, you know, kind of lusting in that sort of, you know, evil, you know, devilry. We've given them Scions of Evil. I think it's like kind of self-explanatory. We wanted an evil race. So they're going to be able to build more troops faster. They're going to get more Imperium. Units are going to be recruited with +1 rank when you have maximum evil alignment. So there's different levels of alignment that you can get, but when you get maximum level of alignment, evil alignment, these guys are going to be even stronger. They're going to start with extra shock units, which are good offensive units, and shield units. Okay, so we're gonna edit these guys just like we have the others, because we have got to give Mim his title. So Mim is, of course, the 6th. We're making him the 6th father of the dwarves. All right, and then that leaves us with one house of dwarves that we need to add to this game. All right, so
starts here.
The final of 7 kindreds of dwarves that are described basically by Tolkien in his essay on the subject are the Stonefoots. And so we'll scroll down here, and I played around with sort of 2 different ideas for the Stonefoots, both of which I wanted to be heavily affiliated with Earth magic. So one was a sort of a more of a barbarian druidic kind of society, but since we already had a dwarven barbarian race, I sort of wanted to go in a different direction, and I wanted to include a mystic culture in this. So this is one of the other cultures that you can choose, and I didn't have that one. So I went ahead and I chose the mystic culture, and I created Thror the Stone Shaper. And so the idea was I wanted this faction to be the sort of easternmost of these dwarven kingdoms. You know, and the idea being that they were sort of dwellers in desert mountains, and maybe even perhaps initially somewhat nomadic, but that they had a very strong affinity with the earth from which they were born, which all dwarves are sort of born out of the earth, you know, and sort of the first fathers being essentially kind of laid into sort of stone tombs, if you will, before they awoke. And so that's the theme that I went with here. Now, when we look at like sort of what we've selected for them, you know, natural choice here, Tome of Rock. You know, it's going to give them different spells that are going to make them tougher. Earthkin. It's going to give them stuff that's going to do damage with Earth. They can summon stone spirits, and they get stone skin, which gives them really, really good defensive benefits. But is a little bit more of a natural orientation to the earth, as opposed to sort of, you know, steel armor or bronze armor or something like this. We made them hardy, so they're pretty tough, and we made them cold-blooded. They're like a rock, right? Not easily cowed. They don't take morale shocks very easily because they're like the stone of the earth. We went with Mystic. Now, this is perhaps a little bit of a departure from the sort of the way Tolkien describes dwarves. He does reference what others in Middle-earth referred to as sort of dwarven magic, but he never really defines sort of like, you know, how the dwarves are able to kind of weave sort of such strength and stuff into their works. And so I wanted to lean into this idea that they do have some affinity for magic, even if it's not as recognizable as sort of kind of the more bold-faced magic of, say, the Elves of Middle-earth. The idea would be that we gave him this mystic culture because it's also very exotic. So they're going to get additional mana. They're going to get attunement star blades. So when they cast a spell, their units are going to get a boost in terms of their damage, elemental damage. And so again, it goes with this whole idea of like building powerful weapons, right? Crafting powerful weapons. Astral Echoes allows them to find special pickups, and sort of the way I kind of sold this in my head thematically was this would be the idea of they're delving for special resources, unique kind of minerals and ores and that sort of thing in the mountains. We've given them Adept Settlers. So this is not particularly useful in this scenario since they're only going to have mega cities. But it does give their population, their capital city, an additional population. And it does help them if they start to conquer some of the other dwarven cities. They will have an additional city cap, which basically means that they can have more cities. We also gave them mana channelers, and so this is the idea that summoning spells are cheaper, and magic origin units have a higher rank. So I wanted to kind of lean into this idea with this attunement with the earth, and sort of that they worship kind of earth spirits, if you will. Now, all dwarves are supposedly worshippers of Mahan, which is essentially their name for Aule, the smith, the Vala, which I discussed earlier on. The idea being that, right, that they're attuned with the earth, and therefore that, you know, the spirits of the earth, you know, sort of will come to their aid here. A little bit, you know, sort of this, like I said, this particular faction choice is perhaps a little bit outside. It's a little bit more exotic and a little bit less grounded in the Tolkien mythology, because I wanted to have a little bit of diversity in the game, so that it felt different when you encountered these different types of factions. But I also wanted to theme it along with what the name of this particular House of Dwarves was, which was the Stonefoots, and so that's what we've got with the Stonefoots. So we're going to edit them, go to finalize. He's going to be the 7th father. And I like the idea of having them have this kind of unique look to them. Okay, so we've got all 7 of our houses of the dwarves.